I started my new army, Dark Eldar, the way most people do, knocking out the combat patrol, and I decided to go with pink. And I kind of assumed that I would paint about 100 pink models, and then by the end of the year, I would have a Dark Eldar army. But then, things kinda changed. For my second batch of models, I painted the Homunculus Coven minis, and I kinda threw my pink scheme out the window. It didn't feel right for these bloody guys, and I love it. I love the variety and want to keep that variety going. And so to achieve this, I have prepared a smorgasbord of Dark Eldar goodies, some of them Games Workshop and some of them my own. I want to try out a new metal recipe that I've been thinking about. I want to kitbash and convert some vehicles to make them gross. I want to paint Games Workshop's cringiest minis and compare them to my own. And I just want to get started because Scott's also building a Dark Eldar army and I'm going to beat him. I love the racks, and the one thing that got me really excited for my first experience with this box is that it came with the vehicle crew bits. I had planned for all of my Raiders and Venoms to be part of my Cabalites, but I think given a few the rack treatment would be pretty wizard. The lore of the racks is that they raid the galaxy and bring back test subjects for the Homunculus' evil experiments, and so we here at Eons of Battle took that to heart. Spinning this tale into a Dark Elf Marauder for transporting captives from the battlefield back to the Dark Elves' lair. We also created the war tents for my elves to spend their off hours in style, the arena walls for keeping those who they want in and all others out, and the pleasure portal used by all the elves to instantly transport themselves and their loot to and from the Dark City. All these pieces can be found on our Patreon for the month of June. I really want to give the racks their own scheme when it comes to vehicles, so I want to test things out on their own unique terrain. I prime the pointy pieces black and then spray them silver to get a baseline of what pure metal looks like. And see, this is why I don't like metallic paint. It's just gray glitter. There's no purpose to it. It doesn't look like I tried at all because I didn't. I just sprayed it silver. I could throw a wash on here and get like the very basics of value and shading, but I don't like it and I don't have fun doing it. So I want to try to come up with a metal recipe that I enjoy and looks good. Black primer is very, very matte. To make black look its blackest, it helps to have a satin finish. I sprayed huge miniatures antimatter black over the parts to make them look darker. Then I sprayed on a desaturated blue from above to start adding in some value. On the portal, I sprayed on the blue very purposefully, deciding on where there would be reflections and what parts would be left in shadow. I dry brushed a light gray over the parts. This dry brushing caught on the edges but could not reach the deepest details, which is perfect. Those would naturally be in shadow. For the portal, I followed the airbrush highlights. This dry brushing sticks mostly to the edges, making it look like non-metallic metal. I feel like I'm getting somewhere. On the blade arms of the portal, I added blue on the points and then a secondary reflective line halfway down the shaft. And I did the same with the white paint, spraying the same spots but depositing less paint, and I dry brushed white to make the spots and edges that are reflecting the most light off the terrain pieces. I think the coldness of the blue and gray is making these parts feel odd, so I introduced a little bit of red-brown into the mix. Metal often looks blue because it's reflecting the sky. Maybe a little warmth will make these pieces feel more real. I put red-brown over the floor grading and I mixed water into this to glaze it over the bottoms of the walls. I dry brushed an earth color in the middle of each flooring section to create a gradient of deep red to yellow-brown in the center in preparation for a dry brushing of gold right in the middle. Then I dry brushed silver over everything else. I think I'm getting somewhere with non-metallic metal over large things. My headcanon for these pieces is that they are all metal, but I only used probably about 10% metallic paint to paint them. And so the look of these guys is based completely on how I wanted them to look and not based on the brightness of the lights in the room. It's all my decision. And speaking of my decision, I want to make some vehicles. I took the crew members off the rack sprues. Unfortunately, I do need to sacrifice a few bodies to be crew members, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make as I want to bring the cold, blood-spattered steel to my Drakari vehicles. These guys now fit like a glove, and I just have to rackify the rest of the elven sailing ships. I took the wicked-looking spears and put these optional bits into all the holes I could find and then grabbed some EOB cages. For the Venom, I have a cage hanging off the back, and I wrapped it in hobby chain, doing one loop around the Venom's handrails and another loop around the tips of the spears. This Venom is going to be bringing the homunculus back something good. Now the Venom is pretty neat and clean. I took some chains from the Raider kit and found where they line up with the hull, and I made some marks drilling these out to add some spikes from the Raider kit for diabolical decoration. Now the Venom is done, it's time to give the Raider the same treatment. And speaking of my Raider, I managed to overspray black paint all over it, but that's okay. In my hobby career, I found that there's a certain level of incompetence that will not affect the final product, and that's the line I like to ride every day. On the decks of the Raiders, I attached some of the EOB racks. These racks reach for their racks to grab some tools to do their racking. And I glued another cage to the bottom of the skiff, giving it the same chain down treatment as on the Venom. I glued on the spikes and prepared for painting. I primed everything black, covering up all the beautiful, robust Soriatech resin that all these models are printed in. It is the most stress-free 3D printing resin we've ever used, and if you would like to try it for yourself, you can find it linked in the description below. I painted the racks first, painting them exactly as I did my last 5 from the previous Drukhari video, and now it's time to make their rides look just as cool as they do. I started out on the Marauder, using gray to start figuring out where my highlights will end up. Then I dry brushed white, hitting the areas I highlighted the most. This will show through on the final as scratches and imperfections in the metal. I sprayed brown paint over the bed of the vehicles as I want this part to be brassy gold, and I used rattling grime thinned down through the airbrush to darken and introduce some subtle warmth to the metal. I dry brushed the flooring gold, and then I dry brushed silver over the rest of the model, following my highlights closely. This makes the edges of the vehicle glisten and makes it feel like the whole model is metallic, when it's actually normal highlights and shading. On the little side sails, I decided to paint these to match the leather skirts of the racks, base coating them with Gargok Sewer and then doing some micro scratches of brown and tan, and then I sponged on some more silver to add in texture. I assembled the Marauder, and the only thing left is that sail. And for the color, I decided on another color for my racks. They're white surgeon's aprons. My little Drukhari U-Haul is looking sharp. I think I did a really good job on getting the metal to look interesting without just being shiny, but it's still missing a little something. It doesn't feel like the racks in my army, and I think what's missing is the blood. I broke out my cutting mat and stuck down some painter's tape. I traced out some circles to make stencils. I put these over the sails and then sprayed on some Scale 75 Instant Color Dragon Blood. I turned the PSI way down on my compressor to make the paint dribble out to make some splatter, and then I threw this over the bow of the ship. I painted some blood drippies coming off of the circles as they have been drawn in blood, and I decided to do a Drukhari symbol in the middle. My first thought was black, but then I decided to bring in the blue I've been using previously for my Dark Eldar to make this vehicle more at home in my collection. Now to try the scheme out on the other two vehicles. I followed the same steps, spraying gray, dry brushing white, and then using rattling grime to shade with the airbrush. Then I made the decks gold, and to add a little more texture, I splatter painted a very, very dark brown over the hulls. I think this makes the rack vehicles a little less pristine like the Cabalites vehicles. I painted the cages with the dark wash, and then dry brushed the whole model with the silver paint, using my biggest dry brush to lay down as little metal as possible. I want these big long bristles to only catch on the edges. I put white paint on the sails and painted the struts to match the hull. I did the same stenciling as before and gave the sails the same treatment I gave the Marauder sails, having the blood pouring off the symbol. I attached the sail to the craft and then just went nuts with the blood, splattering it with the airbrush and making sure the business end of the weapons got a second helping. I finished assembling the crafts and then glued on the pilots and gunners. They are the perfect match for their vehicles. I glued them down to their bases, and now I have a rackin' and rockin' vehicle squadron. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm trying to find a way to do a hybrid between true metallic metal and non-metallic metal where I still have a lot of control over what the final product looks like, but it does look like actual metal, and I think I'm getting pretty darn close. Now that I have a few more Drukhari vehicles under my belt, it's time to work on a little bit of terrain. And one thing I find lacking about some terrain pieces is storytelling. Miniatures definitely tell a story, but sometimes it's hard to make that happen with terrain. You kind of have to turn it into a little vignette. Our terrain are tents, and inside the tents are all the things that a growing Drukhari needs. Luscious pillows and blankets to rest their weary evil heads on. For bases, we made piles of rugs, and to paint these, I sprayed a darker color from one direction and then sprayed a lighter color at an extreme angle from the other direction, so it catches on all the details. Then I masked off these sections and repeated the same steps. I chose nice colors. I imagine these tents are the more the Cabalite speed. The racks probably sleep on a bed of nails. Once I had my colors down, I put a black wash over everything and gave them a dry brushing to bring back the color saturation. And on the parts that are hidden under the tents, I sprayed black paint to add in some shadows. And speaking of those tents, I sprayed those in my Cabalites pink and did some more splatter of light pink paint. And on the fan, I painted this to match my blue Cabalites, painting all the metal parts in a tarnished gold to separate them from the cold, ugly steel I've been using for all of my racks. It's weird to paint something pretty, but that's how the Dark Eldar do. I glued the tents down and they are looking sharp. Now for all the furniture, and for these I painted them using dry brushing, working in layers to bring up the intensity of the colors. Now I can populate the tents, making little scenes for my Drukhari. Who wouldn't want to curl up after a long hard day of raiding on one of these attractive tents? The tents are done, and in my mind, this is what Dark Eldar terrain should look like. Normally Dark Eldar terrain is just Eldar terrain, but with some spikes on it. But the Dark Eldar and the Eldar are very different, and the Dark Eldar need to have their fun. And that is what these tents represent. But now that these suckers are all painted up, I need to break out the oldest and weirdest Games Workshop minis in my collection. Dark Eldar Slave and Prisoner. These really are official Games Workshop minis, meant for decorating raiders and ravagers. Clearly the sculptor was a fan of Star Wars Return of the Jedi. I have really been wondering how these will look painted up. I sprayed a dark beige all over and then a light tan from above. I did a Reikland flesh shade wash and then started highlighting their skin, working in small sections, slowly making gradients to add some interest to their skin. And I made her dress red and her hair white, and I chose white hair for a reason. On this laying down one, I hypothesized that this is meant to be a captured sister of battle who is plotting her escape, as she has the famous bob cut, crazy abs, and is covertly holding a sharp piece of metal behind her back. Whew, these have been sitting in my collection for the longest time, and you know what? They're not as bad as I remember, but I still think mine are much better. Included in this month's terrain pack are our prisoners, meant to decorate Drukhari vehicles and populate the tents. I sprayed a dark beige over the zenithal, letting a little bit of the shadows show through. Then I sprayed a light tan from above. After a Reikland flesh shade wash, I made some gradients on the skin, working all the way up to pure light tan. Then I started picking out their clothing, using the colors I already had on my palette so that they'll match their environments and my army. I painted her leggings and scarf with blue and her dress in red, with some contrast paint brown over her hair. Lastly, I picked out her eyes, finishing off the mini and finishing off this set of Drukhari terrain for my army. I thought I would just bang out a Drukhari army this year, but I have learned a ton working with different methods, different styles, and trying out a ton of things. The prisoners are ready to be placed into their tents, and these tents are ready to be placed onto the board to make for a very thematic deployment zone for my Drukhari cabal. Our artist Liqerise also painted up a set of prisoners in the tents, and they are phenomenal in a hyper color saturated style. My tents more reflect the cabalites of my cabal, garish in pinks and blues and full of nice soft pillows, ready for the dark elves to have a quiet night before heading back out to raid first thing in the morning. The other half of my cabal, the Homunculi Coven, now have some air support. I really like the variety of warships I now have in my collection. The spiky, pointy, bloody vehicles really show off the Homunculus Coven perfectly, and I really like the variety it adds to my army. The racks are ready to throw their nabbed captives through the webway gate to be whisked away to their gruesome masters, the Homunculus. And no one knows what'll happen to them, but it won't be anything good. All of the terrain and accessories I have painted will be available on our Patreon for the month of June. If it's looking good to you, you can find it there. I started this army this year with Scott the Miniature Maniac, who's been working on his Dark Eldar in tandem with me. So far, I have a bunch of minis painted and 105 points on the scoreboard. Scott, old buddy, old pal, when are you gonna show me what you've got?